In 2013, the Xbox One was in trouble. With an announcement that was nothing short of disastrous for the brand, the Xbox One's outlook appeared a bit dire. First, it was the seeming abandonment of games as the business model for the machine, pivoting instead to broadcast TV, DVR functionality, and an overall set-top box direction that just happened to also play video games, as opposed to its predecessor's games-first mentality. Then there was the mandatory inclusion of Kinect, a newer model that rendered the previous generation Kinect incompatible with the current generation console. Most of the Xbox 360 install base, on paper, maybe had the Kinect, but the core audience for the Xbox 360, those who were actually supporters who continued to buy games and consoles even in the wake of the Red Ring of Death crisis early in the 7th generation, had no interest in what Kinect had to offer in regular functionality, terms, or in gameplay. Those types of full-body motion control-centered games had fallen out of fashion, and the hardcore gamers certainly had no interest in them once the Wii Sports honeymoon had worn off, let alone the release of the first generation Kinect. And yet, all of that was overshadowed by the fact of the draconian DRM policy the Xbox One would employ, which would make buying second-hand games or trading games with friends practically impossible, and requiring your Xbox to be online frequently enough to verify your game licenses every 24 hours, lest you temporarily have your license to those games digitally revoked. Xbox One was a mess, and even with Microsoft eventually backtracking on the DRM policies, Kinect remained an issue. The problem was that because Kinect was bundled with every Xbox One unit, the Xbox One ended up costing a full $100 more than the PS4. This was a bit of a double whammy, however, since despite it being more expensive, the hardware itself was, at least on the gaming side, less capable than the PS4 overall. So basically, the situation left Microsoft in the position to ask Xbox 360 owners to upgrade to a machine that gave them no choice but to also adopt a peripheral they probably didn't want, for a machine that was less capable in gaming applications than its competitor for $100 more. For anyone, this is a big ask, and in 2013, the launch of the 8th generation of consoles looked like it was going to be a slaughter, especially given the fact that Sony had changed its tune completely with the PS4 in stark contrast to the tone they took with the PS3 when it launched. Reports from third-party developers were already coming out saying that the Xbox One ports of their games were going to run at lower resolutions than they were on PS4, and some of those games were even going to exhibit worse performance as well. While the state of third-party support wouldn't see anything close to the apocalyptic drop-off that the Wii U had seen, Xbox One, while still in the same performance class as the PS4, would leave its users with an inferior experience, something Xbox 360 users were certainly not happy with, considering that console's reliably superior performance in multi-platform games compared to the PS3. Because of all this, it's pretty obvious to say that Xbox One had an uphill battle the likes of which neither prior Xbox had ever seen. The cards were really stacked against Xbox One, due in great part to a catastrophic miscalculation of industry trends and the purchasing habits and use tendencies of the Xbox install base. But there was still hope. One card that Xbox One had left to win over people to choose it over its competitor: Xbox exclusives. It's unthinkable now, but the 8th generation of consoles is just old enough to have seen the last of third-party exclusive games. In an era where the future of even first-party exclusives have come into question, in 2013, third-party exclusives were the game's next on the chopping block. And yet, Microsoft's ailing console was going to plant its hopes for recovery of its reputation on one of these dying breed of games. What the Xbox presumably needed was an exclusive game that could go toe-to-toe with the PlayStation exclusives of the day, while also proving the rendering capabilities of the hardware to prove to potential buyers that while third-party multi-platform games might suffer in performance, graphics, or resolution, in the hands of capable developers building games which properly leveraged the Xbox One's hardware, it could produce amazing results. They were basically going the route Sony had gone with the PlayStation 3, and given that console's seemingly miraculous turnaround, and the results accomplished with the likes of God of War 3, Uncharted 2, The Last of Us, and Gran Turismo 6, perhaps this could be the hill Xbox One could plant its flag on. And choosing CryTek and a CryEngine game as the means for showcasing a piece of hardware's graphics capabilities on paper makes a compelling argument. Ryse, Son of Rome was that game. The first major game from CryTek, of Crysis fame. The fact that a game built on an engine that was known to bring high-end gaming PCs to their knees and remained a benchmark game for years following its release. The fact that this game was running on an updated version of the same engine on a console many claimed to be underpowered raised some interest in the Xbox One and showed some promise on paper. If the game could stick the landing, it might be the hero of the day the Xbox One needed. It could quite well be the system seller the console needed at this delicate early stage of its life. After all, it was developed by a proven developer who brought gaming both Far Cry and Crysis. Surely Ryse, Son of Rome could have the same quality. Then the game was released, and it became clear to many that the game was kind of a dud. It did not become the system seller it looked like it could have been, and was quickly forgotten as the generation progressed and Xbox took different steps to recover the brand. But it has left me with a question. What made it so mid? Or was it mid at all? Was it misunderstood? These questions kept the memory of this game alive in me, and now, after nearly 13 years, I'm finally going to take a stab at analyzing this game, what made it so intriguing, and where it likely lost its player base. Ryse, Son of Rome is an interesting collection of different aspects about it which give the game a ton of promise but also let it down, leaving the player with a feeling of being underwhelmed by the experience it offers. The biggest thing that separates Ryse from its CryTek counterparts is the fact that instead of taking on a first-person perspective, it instead opts for a third-person view. This is a third-person hack-and-slash style of game where you play as Marius Titus, a general in the Roman army. It tells a classic tale of revenge, dealing with themes mostly rooted in martial honor, betrayal, imperial excesses, rebellion, the will of man versus the will of the gods, etc. It's very Greco-Roman, with the expected modern creative liberties one might expect to make it palatable for the expected mainstream audiences 2,000 years after the reign of Nero, naturally. I believe Ryse, Son of Rome is not only supposed to flex the capabilities of the Xbox One, but also to show the flexibility of the CryEngine itself, maybe like a demonstration of how powerful CryEngine is and what can be achieved with it both in terms of game design and available technologies built within it. And I have to say, CryEngine does make a compelling argument. From a gameplay perspective, Ryse, Son of Rome offers an experience that is surprisingly unique to other third-person action games of this style. Marius has two different types of attacks. There is his sword attack, which is mapped to the X button, and a shield bash with the Y button. It is a little more complicated than that, since there is also a combo system where he will kick someone, for example, but generally speaking, these attacks offer different effects. X button attacks are for dealing straight damage and are probably your most powerful attacks. The Y button attacks, on the other hand, still deal damage but in a lower amount, but with an added stun effect, which can be crucial for dealing with enemies with shields of their own. Both X and Y button attacks also have charged versions, which have greater windup but hit harder and increase the effect relative to the kind of attack you're using. More damage with the X attack and a more potent stun for the Y attack. These can also be essential in the later part of the game with certain enemies who can easily deflect regular attacks. Marius also has defensive options. He has a dodge, which can be activated with the B button. This pretty much behaves very similarly to the rolling dodge in Souls-like games, except I'm not sure if you have very many invincibility frames, since if you don't evade an attack fully physically, even during the dodge animation you can still take damage. Dodging is a useful tactic, but arguably an even more helpful one is the game's parry mechanic. This is activated by pressing the A button during an enemy attack. The parry is an extremely responsive one, and can be activated arguably in much quicker succession than the dodge, and is basically essential for dealing with large crowds of enemies, in which you will find yourself more often than not throughout the runtime of the game. The way the parry works is quite simple. When an enemy winds up for an attack, you press the A button and Marius will automatically parry whichever enemy is attacking first, and will parry every enemy sequentially if you keep pressing the A button when you're attacked by multiple enemies simultaneously from different directions. A parry will momentarily stun the enemy and push them away from Marius. There is also a perfect parry, and these become essential for use against enemies capable of charged attacks. Charged attacks are indicated whenever an enemy is highlighted red while charging up an attack. While these can be interrupted by using a standard X or Y attack, you can also parry these attacks. The trick is that these can't be parried just normally, but by a perfect parry. There is no universal indication for when to time your parry action, but essentially your parry should activate around the time the enemy's attack lands on Marius. The timing is a lot stricter in this regard because the same enemy can have different attacks with very different parry timings, and in many cases, this is happening either during a boss fight or while being surrounded by several other enemies. Landing a perfect parry becomes the dominant strategy when dealing with bosses, since while dodging these charged attacks can be a viable option for opening a window for attack against a boss during their cooldown, the window for attack is comparatively shorter, and since dodging can put additional distance between Marius and the boss, it can sometimes be trickier to actually deal real damage to the boss, making the perfect parry the most optimal way to deal with the later bosses. It's no Bloodborne or Sekiro, so getting the hang of this particular mechanic isn't nearly as time-consuming. One of the major aspects of the combat mechanics in Ryse, Son of Rome, is the addition of executions. Once enemies are damaged to a certain level, an icon will appear over their heads. This indicates that they are open for an execution. Squeezing the right trigger once in this state activates the execution, where Marius will have to do a series of attacks that will finish off that particular enemy. Executions are basically short QTEs, which essentially pause the action surrounding Marius and his selected enemy. The enemy will become highlighted the color of the button you must press in order to perform the execution, those colors being either blue or yellow for X and Y respectively. These button prompts are timed, and from my understanding anyway, the timing registers as perfect when you press the correct button while they are still highlighted the color of the button you are supposed to press. If two adjacent enemies are simultaneously opened to execution, Marius will actually execute both enemies in one execution command in a bespoke animation. Much like how glory kills in the newer Doom games function as a means to farm HP, it works the same way, which can be crucial for survival in the early parts of Ryse. There are different mission types within the levels aside from those involving end-to-end level traversal. The first is basically tower defense. This involves Marius generally commanding his centurions to cover a selected flank, commanding archers to cover an area, and Marius to usually man what is functionally a turret. I can't remember the name of the siege machine, but it's basically a giant crossbow, to fend off against waves of enemies for a certain amount of time. In this case, usually Marius can order a volley from the archers, which can eliminate a large percentage of attacking enemies. There are also mission segments where Marius takes command of a formation of centurions and marches with them against some kind of fortified position. This involves marching up to the base of a fortified enemy position, ordering the formation to create a testudo to defend against the enemy archers, and then taking out the archers by answering their volley with a volley of spears from your formation. Forming the testudo is accomplished by pressing and holding the A button, and to get your formation to throw their spears, you squeeze and hold the right trigger and release to have them fire. The longer you hold down the trigger, the more your formation prepares their spears, and the more enemies are targeted and subsequently taken out once the volley was launched. Interestingly, there is some interesting use of Xbox One controller's haptic feedback and vibration to communicate the charge strength of the volley the longer you have the trigger held down. It's a small detail and maybe not so important in the grand scheme of things, but Ryse, Son of Rome, was attempting to go for a more immersive experience. If you had a microphone or a Kinect, you could actually verbally command your troops as an alternative to holding the left bumper. I'm not sure how accurately the game can read verbal inputs as opposed to the button inputs, since I don't have a microphone or Kinect with my Xbox to try it out, but this was supposed to be an option I think serves as one of the ways this game was trying to utilize the suite of capabilities of the Xbox One in an attempt of what I like to call technology-driven gameplay design. However, it is nice that there is an alternative to the microphone for those without one or a Kinect. Ryse, Son of Rome being powered by CryEngine means that you can't go without mentioning the game's technology. CryEngine games on past generation consoles like the Xbox 360 brought those consoles to their knees in terms of performance, and this game running an even more modern version of the engine that was built to be even more future-proofed and running as well as it does at this level of visual fidelity is probably the biggest flex for the Xbox One. In many combat scenarios, you find yourself surrounded by several enemies who basically set up a Chambara style of combat, where each will charge Marius in sequence, forcing Marius to engage one-on-one with each enemy as they come. It might not sound especially unique, but these enemies are all responding to Marius's attacks and movement independently, and it isn't just the enemies in Marius's immediate vicinity, but all the other enemies around him as well. Maybe this isn't special, I'm not sure, but the fact that individual enemies are running their own individual logic during combat, or at least appear to be, and considering everything else going on around in the scene, must be pretty CPU intensive. The fact that this was all running on a dual quad core with very slow 1.75 gigahertz cores running this simultaneous logic in real time, to me, left me kind of amazed. Even when performing executions, despite slowing time down to slow motion, the AI logic is still running in the background, which is something that you can witness, which is something that I don't recall seeing in other games I've personally experienced. Certainly not from that time. That isn't also to mention the use of ragdoll physics for downed enemies and physics applied to certain select environmental elements while maintaining a playable frame rate. That's not to mention graphics, of course. Ryse Son of Rome is one of the most graphically impressive games the Xbox One had to offer on its launch. Playing this on a base Xbox One where the SSHD mine has makes little to no difference in the game's overall performance, I can say that this game looks great, even on an underpowered console over a decade later. Ryse Son of Rome employs a lot of the graphical effects present in Crysis 3, and while Crysis 3 did get a release on previous generation consoles, it only just existed on them, with performance being so rough even N64 games appear to run at higher frame rates. Here we have smoothed edges thanks to a mixture of anti-aliasing techniques, more realistic material simulations mixing with the real-time global illumination which makes the environments appear more accurately lit. There are some frame rate dips, especially during busier scenes into the mid-20s, but it seems the game runs at an unlocked frame rate, and so in some other scenes there are brief peaks above 30 FPS, but dips happen significantly more frequently. That being said, thanks to the use of motion blur, you can get the illusion of smoother frame rates. Indeed, until looking at the Digital Foundry frame rate test video for Ryse Son of Rome back when the game was first released, I honestly wouldn't have been able to notice this myself. So we are dealing with occasional dips to cinematic frame rates during gameplay at times, but thanks to the fact that this game is a third-person action game, I don't think it hurts the gameplay that bad and still presents smoothly enough thanks to the use of effects like motion blur that makes catching it with an untrained eye a bit difficult. To me, the fact that a game running this smoothly with this level of graphical fidelity, even at the Xbox One's favorite resolution of 900p, is still an impressive showing for a launch title. As a technical demonstration of the capabilities of the Xbox One hardware, it's hard to argue against, and it shows the hardware's real-time rendering potential. So, where did it fail? To call Ryse Son of Rome a failure would be a bit hyperbolic. The game does a lot of what it sets out to do successfully. From a graphics standpoint, it is at its strongest, and is arguably one of the strongest examples of a game which demonstrates the capabilities of a console at its launch, which, at least up until that time, was extremely important. Its gameplay, while derivative to some degree of some other past games released on the previous generation, was executed with an engineered tightness and precision that is highly symptomatic of a game developed by Germans. I mean that as a compliment. However, it didn't win over very many, and I believe that its technical complexity might be one of the reasons why. Ryse Son of Rome aims to replicate the combat system that existed in the Batman Arkham series of games, which are critically acclaimed, very well received games from the 7th generation of consoles. And yet, where might Ryse have fallen short? While I have not yet personally played through the Arkham series of Batman games, what I noticed about the combat here is how largely unexciting it is. While the gameplay might appear to give the game the veneer of complexity, it is really only an appearance. The game has a combo system, but the combo system really mostly accounts to simply alternating between X and Y button pushes in a certain rhythm in order to hit the perfect combo chain during combat. This leads to some pretty repetitive gameplay, and for the most part, since variation in how combat is approached with the game's enemies are fairly limited. You do have the option for charged attacks, but the combo variation translates pretty much identically, even with this slight variation. I believe the introductions of executions probably have the unintended adverse effect of highlighting the game's repetitive combat mechanics rather than adding variety. I think the best way I can explain this can be made through comparison. When Doom 2016 was first properly announced, some people were skeptical of the glory kill system due to fears of the glory kills becoming repetitive to watch after a while. But this was mitigated thanks to a combination of the sheer volume of glory kill animations, all of which were context sensitive relative to the demons and Doomslayer's positioning, the animation speeds, and the benefits to the gameplay loop the glory kills played in actual gameplay. This made them extremely satisfying to execute, even if it was the same handful of glory kills you were seeing over and over again. Ryse, Son of Rome's execution system does have the same gameplay benefit, but it falls short partly due to the lack of variety in execution animations, and ironically, because these are made interactive in the form of QTEs. The lack of variety in execution animations becomes the most clear aspect of this issue of the game first, at least in my experience. Including cutscenes, if you interact with this gameplay mechanic even in a moderate capacity, you will likely see all the game has to offer within the first 30 to 60 minutes of gameplay. The game tries to remedy this by offering context-sensitive camera angles through which it shows these animations based on gameplay. It's very dynamic, which is really cool and cinematic, appropriate for a game of this style. But even this really isn't enough to cover up the fact that you will be performing the same handful of animations for the game's entire runtime. Not only that, but the fact that they are made interactive in the form of QTEs exacerbates the repetition issue. The problem comes from the fact that the QTEs use identical sequences of X and Y button prompts that match every possible animation identically every time. The fact that it also slows down the action, which is already not exactly very fast to begin with, it emphasizes these executions as a centerpiece of the action, but since they are so easy to execute, matched with the same inputs, matched with the same handful of animations, ends up rendering executions unexciting to pull off after a while. While there are some cutscene sensitive executions that only take place during scripted sequences that do differentiate themselves from the regular gameplay, most of what you're looking at are the same executions and same button inputs over and over. The game's combat speed is another thing that might give the impression to players that the game is a bit middling. While it does emphasize some elements of combat that we would see from later FromSoft games like Bloodborne with the emphasis on parrying, the game's speed is much too fast to be along the lines of a Souls-like experience. On the flip side, however, the game's comparatively shallow combat mechanics and game speed being the medium speed that it is doesn't exactly make it a contender for the more action-heavy hack-and-slash games of the time like Bayonetta 2 or Devil May Cry 4 or God of War 3, for example. It exists in some nebulous middle ground where your combat strategies, while timing attacks and defenses to manage combat encounters where you find yourself outnumbered and surrounded, it never quite feels taxing. In fact, I found the game's combat gameplay loop to be more relaxing than anything else, which is very strange to say for a game with this level of violence. I neglected to mention earlier that the game also consists of an RPG style progression where you can purchase upgrades to Marius to make him stronger. The currency you use to make these upgrades, including upgrades to HP and focus gauges, as well as combat proficiency, are earned during combat and are awarded in varying amounts based on your performance during combat encounters. The game also gives you the option to pay for these upgrades in gold, which I'm assuming are in-game currency that you can buy using real money. I'm not entirely sure, and I might very well be wrong about this, but that's only because the addition of the gold currency is totally superfluous. Even if you are moderately okay at the game's combat mechanics, you'd be hard-pressed not to have a fully upgraded Marius well before the game's end. And ending the game with excess points you can't spend on anything else. Honestly, it is difficult to notice, aside from increases to HP and focus capacities, the difference these stat increases even make in combat, but I assume they must do something. Focus is a gameplay mechanic that kind of matches the bullet time of games like Fear with the Berserk power-up from the recent Doom games. Essentially, when in combat, if you press the right bumper, Marius will enter a powered-up mode where enemies slow down and he speeds up and becomes stronger in his attacks. This has the function of performing crowd control and can be useful in dispatching stronger enemies when you're surrounded by enemies and find yourself tanking damage unsustainably. Don't try using this against bosses, however, it won't work. Focus will last only as long as your focus gauge is filled, and the focus gauge is refilled by points awarded during combat based on performance. Focus has a clear utility, and it's undeniable, but with combat being as simple as it is with respect to its 2-button alternating combo system, I often found myself forgetting that I had the focus power to begin with, since more often than not, I had a plethora of other options seemingly more readily available at my disposal to deal with overwhelming crowds of enemies before focus entered consideration. The fact that this seems to be useless against bosses also kind of takes away from the power's utility in combat. While it is a cool idea, in execution, it rings a bit hollow. One of the other aspects where this game probably falls short is the apparent lack of enemy design variety. The game features between 4 to 5 different enemy types. This is tied to their combat style, and every combat style has a single kind of character design. If you're fighting the Britons, your light, medium, heavy, shielded, and dual-wielding enemy types all look the same to each other within their classes. While highly detailed, the fact that you are basically fighting an army of clones and executing basically the same guys in every encounter, it becomes a bit visually monotonous. Again, kind of adding to the game's somewhat relaxing, turn your brain off feel. The only real variations between enemy designs you see are based mostly on where they come from or the story or setting context. So when you fight Britons, which you see most of the time, they appear uniformly across all classes. When you fight the barbarians who build wicker men, the enemy designs change but preserve the same enemy class styles. You fight Praetorian guards who have a single combat style variation, and then gladiators who are the same as the Britons and other barbarians. Despite the different enemy skins, they all follow the same basic design principles, so they only really amount to skin changes rather than anything more meaningful relative to the same basic combat classes, all of whom are dealt with using the same combat strategies. On top of all of this, the game's final runtime on a first-time playthrough for me amounted to just over 5 hours, including cutscenes. Now personally, I don't mind games that are on the shorter side, so long as they offer a strong gameplay loop or sense of replay value. I'm generally okay with games of this length. But in 2013, for a full-priced launch meant to be the Xbox One system seller, the thing you used to demonstrate to everyone how cool your new system upgrade was, and to showcase the next generation of games, 5 hours of this kind of gameplay probably felt a little lean to those early adopters. This was back during a time when popular independent internet reviewers would emphasize the shortening length of single-player campaign games, especially in games like Battlefield or Call of Duty, basically as a form of protest against the industry's apparent growing rejection of single-player experiences in favor of the multiplayer cash cow. Considering Ryse did push for some level of multiplayer integration, probably pushed that narrative even further. At the same time, given its style of gameplay, you could also argue that the game's length is actually proportionally appropriate, since if the game went on for any longer, you might have had even more complaints about the game's depth in terms of combat. That, alongside the fact that the game's levels are deceptively linear, likely due to the fact that Ryse is pushing such technological boundaries for the time on what was factually anemic hardware, obviously in hopes of preserving gameplay stability. What we are basically left with in Ryse is something CryTek have been accused of making many times before in games like Far Cry and Crysis, a glorified tech demo. After finally playing through this game myself, it's hard to find myself disagreeing with the sentiment of this accusation. I'm seldom one to dogpile a game with this kind of accusation, since it is often used as a way to hand-wave games away uncritically. I can't in good faith agree with that accusation being levied against either Far Cry or Crysis, since those games are both substantial and fun to revisit, and offer gameplay mechanics that add a lot of variety to the experience on repeat playthroughs. Ryse, on the other hand, I find more difficult to defend. The technology is stunning, it truly is. I couldn't appreciate it when it was new simply because I couldn't get my hands on an Xbox One, but even in 2026, looking at this game and seeing it running and doing its magic has left me impressed anyway. Maybe it's with the aid of hindsight, but what this game manages to do is quite amazing, especially given the strict hardware limitations it was built around. However, aside from the higher difficulty levels, I find it difficult to find a reason to go back to it. When I say it's turn your brain off levels of gameplay, I really mean it. You could run through this game in your sleep if you've ever played a third-person action game of this kind before. Even games like the One Chambara Origin have a more engaging gameplay loop, and that's a game built on a much tighter budget. While I still believe that this game is far more than a mere tech demo, it does have the energy of one, which is kind of a shame, especially for a game which was banking on being the system seller for the Xbox One at launch. At the end of the day, Ryse Son of Rome's marketing raised the game's public hype to levels that, in retrospect, probably set the game up for failure. While I don't think the game was a failure, and it delivered the experience largely intended by the developers, it was also clear that the game's lackluster performance among audiences was thanks to the discrepancy between what was promised in the hype cycle versus what we actually got. It's a fine game. It's totally serviceable. If you can appreciate the tech, then it's kind of mind-blowing, especially if you're running the game on a base Xbox One like yours truly. But it's not enough to cover up the game's comparatively bare-bones gameplay and character design variability. If ever there were a game that personified mid as a concept, I think Ryse would be that personification. But just because something is mid doesn't mean it's bad. Mid carries a negative connotation, but in reality, sometimes a mid-tier game is just what you wanted for a specific occasion. So, despite its mid reputation, I still think Ryse has an innate value it has to offer in its midness. And you know what? I have to respect that. Keep retromaxing.